Hello, and welcome to The Wider Lens, which is exploring how we move from a degenerative system to a system which allows all living things and humanity to thrive and flourish. I'm Jyoti Banerjee. I'm CEO and co-founder of North Star Transition.
Hello, I'm Jenny Scott. I'm a founder partner at Appella Advisors. We're going to be looking at how to change complex systems, and in particular, how to catalyse that change from within society.
So, Jenny, today is the second episode of our exploration of what it takes to transition. And we're talking today about how corporates can transition. Perhaps you can get me started in understanding, why do corporates need to transition and what are they transitioning to?
Yeah, so I've got a sort of slightly love-hate relationship with corporates, I say. I'm a bit of a hybrid, having trained as an economist, but then gone into sectors like the Bank of England and the BBC and Reuters, and so not exactly on the front line of the corporate world, but always.
When you say not in the front line, you mean not the capitalist corporate world?
Yes, exactly. But with a, I would say, with a sort of, with my ear to the wall of what's going on in the corporate world, whether that was as a journalist or um, looking at communications at the Bank of England. So I kind of know the corporate world, but I'm not entrenched in it. But I know enough about it to realise that it could be a really important part of getting us to move as a whole society away from a degenerative one to a regenerative one, which is what we've been talking about. But a lot of obstacles, I would say, along the way, which I think we're going to probably come to.
And you have your own consulting business, Appella Advisors, and Appella works with corporates.
Absolutely, yeah. We work with. We're proud to work with a lot of the big corporates, and help them with their purpose and help them with all of their strategic communication. So, very fortunate to be able to listen in on the corporate conversations that are going on at the sort of C-suite level, which again is really, really helpful when you're trying to understand the incentives behind what's going to make a corporate transition, and also the obstacles and the trade-offs that are stopping that transition. But you've got a corporate background as well, haven't you? You may not be deep in the corporate world now, but you have.
Well, perhaps not because I worked at a corporate, but a number of corporate organizations hired the businesses that I was involved in. And so we worked closely with companies like Microsoft and SAP in the tech world. But more recently, I was involved in the creation of a more holistic corporate reporting framework, which is known as integrated reporting. And there are perhaps 2,500 or so corporates around the world who use that framework. And since we developed it as a collaborative effort, it meant that I engaged with a large number of corporates around the world for that work. But what I find interesting is we cannot imagine how we can transition the world we live in unless we get the corporates involved. Because if you just look at the 1,000 largest corporates across the world, their contribution to global GDP is over 40%. So if you took that 40% chunk and said, okay, we can't do anything with that, really, is it realistic that we're going to be able to change how our system works and move it away from degenerative outcomes? We need corporates involved. So let me ask you this question. Are corporates getting ready to change how they work? Are they getting ready for a different kind of system out there? Because whether we like it or not, the climate emergency is upon us, the biodiversity emergency is upon us, and that's true for everybody. If a house in California burns down, all the houses in the area burn down, whether you've got a good fire system or not.
I think there's not one single answer to that, because it's incredibly complex and dependent on so many other things. So it can depend on what structure the corporate takes, whether or not there are shareholders, hammering at the door saying, we want a return and we want it every single quarter. That's obviously going to make it very, very difficult to make the long-term decisions that you need in order to transition, because they're probably going to be very, very expensive in the short term. And unless you've got a really, really strong story to tell the shareholders who will let's sort of go on that journey, horrible word, but go on that process with the corporate, then you're just going to fall at the first hurdle, because shareholders aren't going to want you to spend the money that it takes. So, there are also sort of hybrid governance models where you're not quite a charity and you're not quite a shareholder. You're somewhere in between, and then you've got a little bit more leeway to do it. You're also operating in an environment where, as a corporate, you've got to respond to your customer, haven't you? There's no point in you existing if your customer doesn't want the good or the service you're producing. So there's an element of us as people having to say to the corporates that we buy our goods from and our services from, we want you to change. We want you to go down this path. And then, of course, that gets really complicated because, A, we don't know what that might look like. So it's quite difficult to vote for something that you're not quite sure the structure of it. And B, you don't quite know how much more that might cost you and whether it might cost you more in the short term, but less in the long term. So therefore, you might want to do it because you think it's the right thing to do, or because you want your kids to have the benefit of you spending a little bit more now. And if the corporates aren't getting a really clear signal from the customers that they need to change the way they operate right now, they're probably not going to operate, because they live in a society where they respond to the signals. And of course, again, those signals are all confused by things like fossil fuel subsidies, which make some of the goods and things that we buy a lot cheaper than they really should be if you were taking account of the pollution that they caused. So it's really
Whether
not
you have the
straightforward.
subsidies or not, fossil fuel causes pollution and we don't pay the price for it.
No, absolutely, because we don't have an agreed carbon tax. So kind of saying to corporates, you've just got to transition, it's just not as simple as that. Obviously, there's a massive part for them to play, I think, but they are, like everyone else, like we talked last time, stuck in a system that means if they try and transition on their own as a single organization, it's going to be incredibly hard, because they're part of a massive value chain. They buy their goods from someone else who sources them from someone else who might get the raw material from someone else. They may be in a different country with a different laws around accountability and sustainability and regulation. They're all under different regulatory regimes. So it's not enough to say corporate transition. It's got to be, what's the regulator doing? What's the customer want? What are the rules around value chain and what you can and can't do, and what the standards are along that.
And what does the investor want?
And absolutely. It's sort of, they're pulling the strings all the while in the background. But can I just give you a small example of how sort of translating this into the real world? So say you're a distribution company and
Are you talking about a real distribution company,
Well,
or is this still in
conflating a few organizations,
Okay,
so I
go
won't
for
name
it.
names, but
Yeah.
say you're a distribution company and you've got a big fleet of vehicles. You would think, this is really, really simple. If I want to get to net zero, I've just got to get electric vehicles. It's one of the simplest organizations you can imagine to transition. And then you think about it a bit more and the actual reality of it, and you think, well, first of all, I've got to source the electric vehicles at a price that means I can still stay profitable. And if I really want to pay heed to the social part of this, then I'd really like to buy my electric vehicles in this country. And then you might have a problem, because you might not be able to find enough electric vehicles in this country made by a factory locally at a price that you can afford. So you've already thought, okay, well, maybe I have to lobby the government to keep this factory open or subsidize it so I can get this electric vehicle. So already you've got this other actor in the play that you need to try and get on board. And then you think, all right, if I get an electric vehicle for everybody, the people who are going to be driving those electric vehicles are going to have to charge them somewhere. What if they live in a flat in the middle of the city where we don't have the infrastructure in order for them to plug in their vehicle at night? They're not going to want to take on an electric vehicle, which means they have to go somewhere and park it. So you're dependent on another actor, which is the infrastructure that is needed in order to make the electric vehicle a viable proposition. And then you've got to get a bunch of people who are driving the electric vehicles with their hearts and their minds and everything to really, really want to do this, because it's going to be a bit annoying to have to, change your vehicle and everything. So again, more actors that you've got to bring into it. So it's just one example of what looks so incredibly simple in terms of transitioning. When you really dig into it, if you were the CEO of that organization, there's a lot of moving parts. So it's not about competition, it's massively about collaboration.
And yet we need these companies to move
Absolutely.
because the outcomes could be so significant if they could move, but also so damaging if they continue doing the same things that they've always done. I was in a conversation with a company, really well-known company. We all wear their clothes and wear their shoes. And at the time, it was a family-owned business. And it was run by uh, by the members of the family, but the most senior non-family member was the chief operating officer. And I was having a conversation with him at the time, and he was telling me about all the good stuff that they were doing in the business, because this is one of the most responsible apparel companies out there, et cetera, et cetera. And then he said to me, Jyoti, you have to remember that we're doing all of this in the context of an industry where the only way apparel companies can make a profit is because they can exploit South Asian and Southeast Asian women. And I was thinking, wow, this is one of the best of the best. And yet they operate in a system that is so broken that it only works because of this exploitation of women. Does it actually make sense to transition a company? Because the entire system needs to change. How do we reconcile what works for a company and how does it help enable that kind of systemic change that we need to see happen?
I think you probably put your finger on a couple of things that need to be there, which is one is this idea of internal alignment. So the company itself has to want to be part of that transition and has to set up the right governance. It has to come from the CEO and the chair. Everyone has to be on board right at the top.
But it's not just the top.
No,
When you
it's
talk
all the
about
way
internal
through.
alignment.
Yeah, exactly. So, and it's got to be obviously cross-departmental, but it's got to be, I think, again, our colleagues at UCL have pointed this out. They talk about this sort of permafrost layer of middle management where the CEO might get this need to transition and the sort of the Gen Z at the bottom are really, really enthusiastic about it. But you've got this sort of impermeable middle management. They've been in the business for 20 years and they know they're comfortable with profit targets and making decisions by margin and assessing whether to build a new factory based on whether or not you're going to get the return on investment. To change that cohort of people to think about this other variable around transition and pollution and sustainability and social criteria and so forth is incredibly difficult. Not impossible, but incredibly difficult. So when we talk about internal alignment, I think we mean, as you say, everyone from the top of the company to the bottom of the company and going across as well. Everyone sort of, from HR through to ops. But as you just said, you can be the best, have the best intentions in the world as a company, but if you're in a degenerative system, it's still going to be really hard. So you then need external alignment within other organizations, within your system. And then, as we talked about before, you can't just stop there. You've got to then talk about the other systems, whether that's people part of your value chain or completely different who eventually lead into affecting your system. And again, it's incredibly difficult to happen. It has to be a mindset. It has to be around collaboration, not competition. You have to have enough data to be able to see what's happening and have evidence of what's happening, but not wait for so much that you're on the never, never and going, well, we'll make a change. Well, we haven't quite got that last piece of data, or that regulation's not quite there for us yet. So we're just going to hold off, because if everyone does that, then you never, ever get there.
And so interesting when you say collaboration, not competition, because if you think of the way in which we've learned how to do strategy, it's all about what's my competitive advantage against you. I couldn't care less what happens to you. I'm interested in me. It's the Porter idea, if you like. And yet, in a sense, we're now in a position where we have to reimagine what strategy looks like, where we're going to have to collaborate with each other to enable the system to shift, to enable the outcomes that we need to see happen. So how do you think a corporation can begin that transition journey in a way that's actually going to make sense, given all these challenges you've talked about?
So I wonder if part of it is about translating it into that language and those metrics that people already understand. So in other words, making a business case alongside it. So in the case of the electric vehicles, there's a very good possibility that you'll get more progress with the government and EV factories if you collaborate with a whole bunch of your so-called competitors who also need to buy electric vehicles. If you all stump up at the door of number 10, you're probably going to get a better result than if one of you does. So that's one thing. And also if you take, say, a sort of consumer goods sector, it takes something like 5 to 8 years to develop a new consumer good from an idea to it being on the shelves. That's a long time now in transition world in terms of making sure that what you're thinking about now is actually going to be, regenerative or sustainability proof in 8 years' time. So you can definitely see an example where maybe the supermarket that you're selling your goods to is also trying to get to a better place in 8 years' time. So can you collaborate now to what that looks like? And to make that real, say Tesco says, right, you can sell shampoo, but we're only going to give you that much space on the shelf, a much smaller space than you used to have. So that you can that gives you a lever to go back to your product development people and say, we still need to sell X amount of shampoo and we still need to get this amount of margin, but we've got a lot less shelf space. So how about we take it out of the big plastic bottles and we make it into bars? They take up less shelf space, less packaging. If regulation we can anticipate in 8 years' time will mean that you're going to get penalised for having plastic bottles, great, we're going to save money because we're going to put them in cardboard. So suddenly the business case starts to stack up for changing from wasteful big plastic bottles of shampoo into shampoo bars in cardboard. But you need to do that now because it's going to take you the 8 years to get it onto the shelves. So it's that idea of, again, looking across the different systems and banding together to get the better outcome for both of you, because Tesco's will win because they can then put lots of different products from different suppliers on shelves because there's more space.
So really, we are looking at a really complicated thing, which is to get corporates to transition, given their multiple challenges and the stakeholders involved and so on and so forth. But we have only just started this transition journey. And next time, we're going to be looking at something even more complicated, which is how would you transition an entire nation? And so that's going to bring us into new challenges. But in a sense, the corporate journey feels almost compact enough to work with because there are people in the organization who know what resources are available and can make decisions to say, this is how we're going to do it. Whereas when you get to a nation level, it becomes a little more unbounded and much more complicated to bring everybody together.
Absolutely. The exciting part of that, though, is that when you're at nation scale, you have probably a few more levers. So you might be able to use regulation a bit more effectively. You might, be able to get enough support for a carbon tax, or you might be able to change the incentives enough on a nation scale to drive the behavior you want without using the blunt instrument of changing the law. So yes, absolutely, the ecosystem of a corporate is actually quite constrained and neat compared with the ecosystem in a whole nation. But with those extra challenges come extra opportunities. So I'm looking forward to how you're going to tell us, Jyoti, how to transition a nation next time.
We'll do that next time. So as always, if you're interested in following what we're doing, then you can check us out on our website, www.northstartransition.org. You can follow us on LinkedIn, you can follow us on Instagram, or if anyone's interested, they could send us an email, and it's info@northstartransition.org. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you for listening.